Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa, and today I continue my Dominaria limited review. So far I've talked about every single card in the set except for the colorless multicolored cards and lands, and that's what we're going to cover in this video. Limited review doesn't end today, by the way. I still have a video talking about my picks for the best commons and uncommons coming out, an archetype guide, and a top 10 list about the biggest bombs in the format. So stay tuned for those. Now, let's get started by talking about all the gold cards in Dominaria. And if you want to know how I come up with these grades, there's a link in the description below that can show you how I come up with them. And the rest of the limited review, the playlist for it, can be found in the link below. Now, on to our first card. First up, we have Delese, the Cinder Wind, which for one generic, a blue and a red, is a 2/2 legendary creature human wizard with flying and haste. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, wizards you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So this is a signpost uncommon. Basically, all of the uncommon gold cards in this set are signpost uncommons. In this set, they all happen to be legendary creatures, which is flavorful because that's a lot of what they're doing in this set is legendary creature things. And the point of a signpost uncommon is generally to tell you what direction a certain color pair is going in, and they're generally pretty powerful. Like if you can play them, if you're in their color pair, they're going to be very powerful. If you want to hear me talk more about the archetypes in particular, that's something that I'll do more in the archetype guide. But obviously enough, blue-red is about both wizards and casting instants and sorceries. The nice thing about Delese is that you don't need a ton of wizards for her to be good. Though she certainly gets better if you have a bunch. On her own, she's essentially a 3-mana 2/2 with haste and flying, and sort of has prowess. It's a little more narrow than prowess, but it's basically prowess. But the point is that this is good and can stand on its own. The card is a build around in two different ways, but it isn't like it has a horrible floor. I mean, a 3-mana 2/2 with flying and haste would already be playable. I think it's a C+ in a deck that has like 0 wizards and 5 instant or sorcery spells, and obviously it moves up from there. If you really get there and have several wizards and 8 or more instants and sorceries, I think it moves all the way up to a B+. She's going to be great, probably worth that B+ grade, and because it has a reasonable floor and such a high ceiling, I think in some weak packs I might consider first picking this despite being gold. Most gold cards are a little risky to first pick because of the fact that you have to be in 2 colors for it to work out. But in this case, I think it's probably worth it because the payoff is so good and the fail case is so reasonable. Next, we have Vaud the Cursed, who for 3 generic, a white, and a black is a 3/3 legendary creature vampire knight at uncommon. He's got Death Touch, he's got Lifelink, and other legendary creatures you control get +2/+2. So again, another very powerful card if you're doing the right thing in black-white. It can stand on its own. A 5-mana 3/3 with Lifelink and Death Touch is pretty good, but obviously if you have Vaud, you want to be valuing legendary creatures a little more highly, because he gives them a massive stats boost of +2/+2. Legendary creatures are more common in this set than they have ever been, at least since Kamigawa block, but they still only appear at uncommon or higher. As a result, getting a large number of legendary creatures isn't the easiest task. If I had to estimate, I would say the average deck in the format will probably have 4 or 5 legendary creatures in it, but because Vaud is already good on his own, that's probably enough for him to be pretty good. If you get more than that, he's going to be very powerful. I'm going to give him a C+, and if you manage to get enough legendary creatures, like, 7 or 8, he probably moves up to a B. I would go even higher if I thought you could get like 10 or 12 legendary creatures, but that's almost never going to happen, and so I'm going to cap him out around B. Alright, next we have Ariel, Knight of Windgrace, who for 2 generic, a white, and a black is a 4/4 legendary creature human knight at rare. She's got Vigilance. You can pay 2 generic and a white and tap her to create a 2/2 white knight creature token with Vigilance, and you can pay 1 black and tap her to tap X untapped knights you control and destroy target creature with power X or less. This card's insane. A 4-mana 4/4 with Vigilance is already an okay deal, but she is absolutely insane thanks to these activated abilities. She can create knight tokens at a fairly reasonable cost and can tap knights to kill creatures. The great thing is that both she and the knight she create have Vigilance, so they can attack and still threaten to use these activated abilities. While Ariel is a gold card, she's an engine all on her own and doesn't have to be built around to be powerful. You could have literally 0 other knights in your deck and she's going to be good. But if you're in black-white, you're just going to have other knights naturally. There are a lot of them in that color pair. Despite being gold, I think if you open Ariel, you probably take her because her ceiling is insane. If you don't end up playing black-white, it's going to hurt, but there's just so much upside here. I'm going to start her at A-. She's really only held to that grade because she's gold. She's a huge bomb in this format. I mean, she's a token engine and a source of repeatable removal, and that's just insane. Next up, we have Daragaz, Reincarnated, who for 4 generic, a black, a red, and a green is a 7/7 legendary creature dragon at mythic rare. He has Flying, Trample, and Haste. If he would die, instead you exile it with 3 egg counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Daragaz is exiled with an egg counter on it, remove an egg counter from it. Then, if he has no eggs on himself, return it to the battlefield. Last time we saw Daragaz, he was pretty disappointing, all things considered. And I think he's disappointing here again. I don't know if they did that on purpose. Sure, a huge creature who can attack right away and is basically impossible to effectively block is nice, but I kind of expect that for 7 mana across 3 different colors. The fact that he comes back later is good, but I feel like he's a little slow at coming back to be worthy of this mana cost. Sure, he has haste, and that sort of takes off one of the egg counters on its own, but I don't know. I just wish he did something more than be a big dumb creature who can potentially keep coming back. Worth noting that there are several ways at common and uncommon to exile creatures too, and that will feel especially painful when they do that to your 7-drop. Still, he can end a game in a hurry, and if you find yourself in one of these color pairs, splashing Daragaz as a finisher isn't a bad plan, especially if green is one of your base colors. But you don't want to first pick him or take him over removal or anything like that, and I think that means he's a C+. Next we have Garna the Bloodflame, which for 3 generic, a black, and a red is a 3/3 legendary creature, human warrior at uncommon. She has Flash. When she enters the battlefield, you return to your hand all creature cards in your graveyard that were put there from anywhere this turn, and other creatures you control have haste. That is a lot of text crammed onto a single card. Basically all of these signpost uncommon cards feel like they would be rares in most sets, and this is no exception. It just does a ton of stuff. A 5-mana 3/3 with Flash that gives all your creatures haste would already be a pretty solid creature, I think, but the other 4 lines of text on this are what make it really good. Keep in mind that you get back creatures who are put into your graveyard from anywhere. This means that if you mill cards into your graveyard or discard a creature card, she can get that back. Still, the most common way to get value with her is going to be to trade with some of your opponent's creatures, either when you are the one attacking or blocking, then flashing her in or casting her in your second main phase and getting them all back, and that's going to be backbreaking. Basically, Garna makes sure you're not trading with your opponent because you get all your cards back. She might be a little clunky at 5 mana, and she might not do a ton on her own, but her ability to bring back powerful creatures you lost in one turn is very powerful, especially when combined with Flash and Haste. Still, all of that does involve some rather intricate setup, and while it will be a common game situation to just be able to trade and get a couple creatures back, there will also be times where Garna's Enter the Battlefield trigger is basically irrelevant. You have to hope your opponent blocks the right way for it to work out. She does have some synergies with sacrifice effects. In that case, you don't have to hope your opponent does anything, and in some ways that's the best way to use her, to sacrifice a couple creatures to draw a couple cards, with the Thallid that lets you do that, and then get them both back. That's going to be some serious value. And in that case, you don't have to worry about what your opponent's going to do, but if your opponent decides not to block the way you want to or not to attack the way they want to, you may not get much back with her. And the fact that you can mill cards from the top of your library and she can get those back isn't going to come up that often either, since she costs a whopping 5 mana. So being able to mill and cast her in the same turn will come up, but only really in the very late game. And if you do that, you're probably just going to win because of the value she gives you, but it's just not going to happen that often. But even in those situations where she doesn't do much, she's still a decent-ish sized creature who gives haste to everyone, and that's not too bad. But I'm going to start her at C+, just because she's going to be, hard to make work all the time, and I don't want... She's not a gold card you want to first pick, basically, because her power level is... She has an incredibly high ceiling, but her floor is just so mediocre, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Next, we have Grand Warlord Radha, who for 2 generic, a red and a green, is a 3/4 legendary creature elf warrior at rare. She's got haste, and whenever 1 or more creatures you control attack, add that much mana in any combination of red and or green. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. Well, she's back, and she's good again. A 4 mana 3/4 haste gives you some nice base stats, but the fact that every creature you attack with produces mana is nuts. This format seems to have a lot of places to spend all this excess mana thanks to kicker costs, and red-green is the place where there is more kicker than anywhere else. In addition to that, she can also just help you ramp into bigger and scarier creatures. Sometimes she will make it worth it to just chump attack with a couple of saprolings for the extra mana. She's great and good enough to consider first picking despite being gold, which I think makes her a B. Next we have Halar, the Fire Fletcher, who for 1 generic, a red and a green, is a 3/3 legendary creature elf archer at uncommon. He's got trample, and whenever you cast a spell, if that spell was kicked, put a +1/+1 counter on Halar, the Fire Fletcher. Then Halar deals damage equal to the number of +1/+1 counters on it to each opponent. So this is red-green signpost uncommon, and it shows you that red-green is about kicker, which Radha synergizes well with, but this guy really wants you to be kicking things. And again, red-green is where you find the most kicker costs. And this creature really makes sure you get extra value out of them, making himself larger and shooting the opponent in the face every time you kick a spell. Obviously a build around, but Halar is still a 3-mana 3/3 with trample, and even if you never kick a single spell, that's a reasonable floor. And your average red-green deck is going to be hard-pressed not to have cards with kicker. You'll probably have 3 or 4 anyway, and so I think the fail case for this card is like a C+. He has some great upside, though. If you have like 7 or so spells with kicker, your deck has a lot of ways of ramping and being able to pay kicker costs. He's going to get to be just a win condition all on his own, and I think he gets all the way up to a B in a deck with a lot of kicker. Next up is Joyra, Weatherlight Captain, who for 2 generic, a blue and a red, is a 3/3 legendary creature human artificer at Mythic Rare, and whenever you cast a historic spell, you draw a card. Historic spells are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. So Joyra's good, but she doesn't really feel like a mythic to me. She needs a keyword ability or something to really push her over the edge, but historic spells do abound in this format. There are lots of legendary creatures, artifacts, and sagas to be had, and she makes them all replace themselves, which means you will draw more cards, which means you'll draw more historic spells, and it creates a nice snowball effect where you will just outcard your opponent. While she is a bit of a build-around, it isn't like cards that are historic are going to be hard to come by. I think getting about 7 historic spells is going to be like what you do in your average limited deck, because you're going to be getting a few artifacts, a few legendary creatures, and maybe like 1 saga. Obviously, if you have more than that, she does get better. But her stats aren't that good, and she doesn't have an evasive ability. She's not going to be able to attack on a lot of board states. She's just going to be a source of card advantage, which isn't a bad thing, but she's sort of underwhelming to me just because as a mythic rare and being, you know, an iconic creature from Magic's past, I thought she would just be even better. And I'm not saying she's bad. She's a solid B. She's the kind of mythic rare that's gold that you'll first pick out of a pack despite being a mythic rare. Despite being gold, and that is, you know, saying something, but you know, she could be better is all I'm saying. Just give her menace or something. I don't know. Anyway, on to the next card. Next, we have Joda, Archmage Eternal, who for 1 generic, a blue, a red, and a white, is a 4/3 legendary creature human wizard at rare. He has flying, and you may pay all 5 colors, 1 of each color, rather than pay the mana cost for spells that you cast. Not overly excited. He has good stats for 4 mana, that's for sure, but getting 3 colors of mana is no easy task, especially if you're venturing outside of green, and making your spells cost 1 of each color isn't exactly upside and limited. Fixing isn't so generous that you'd rather pay those colors than like 5 generic mana and 2 red for something. He definitely has some fun potential in formats like EDH, but in limited, he's just a difficult to cast, but fairly efficient flyer. The rest of the text on him doesn't really matter, and I'm just going to give him a C. If you end up in those 3 colors, obviously you'll just play him because his stats are solid, but the rest of his text box doesn't really matter. Next, we have Madrasah, the Gravetide, who for 3 generic, a black, a green, and a blue, is a 6/6 legendary creature elemental avatar at Mythic Rare. During each of your turns, you may play up to 1 permanent card of each permanent type from your graveyard. Yeah, this card's really cool. 6 mana for a 6/6 is a good deal, and while this is hard to cast, it at least has green in its casting cost, so fixing is easier to come by than in other colors. The card will very quickly help you overwhelm your opponent, thanks to the fact that you play 1 permanent of every type of each turn, or at least you can. Sure, you need to have cards in your graveyard to make Madrasah do her thing, but that shouldn't be that hard by turn 6. You can also put your opponent in a really bad place by attacking with a creature they can trade with, when they know you can just get it back from your graveyard. I think Madrasah pays you off for how hard she is to cast and can do so very quickly. Still, her grade does have to be suppressed, since getting Sultai mana isn't going to be a walk in the park. But if you get to untap with her, you're just going to win most likely. So I'm going to give her a B. Despite being 3 colors, I think because she has green in her cost and because she's so powerful, I would definitely first pick her in like 99% of packs. If the pack doesn't have a monocolored, really powerful spell like in Bolus's Clutches or Fire with Fire or something, I think you take Madrasah a lot of the time. It's just really, really good. And yeah, you do have to prioritize fixing a little bit, but luckily, if green is one of your base colors, it's not going to be that hard to get. Next, we have Oath of Teferi, who for 3 generic, a white, and a blue, is a legendary enchantment at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you exile another target permanent you control. You return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, so it flickers something. You may activate the loyalty abilities of planeswalkers you control twice each turn, rather than only once. This is not an oath that is very good in limited. Some of them are like playable in limited. Some of them are actively good in limited. Like Oath of Chandra was actually like a good removal spell. But the problem with them is they're really built around the idea of having a Planeswalker in play, and that's just not going to happen very often. Planeswalkers are all at Mythic, and you're probably not going to get them very frequently. This one does get to be okay, I guess, in a world where you have creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities, or your creatures have aura-based removal on them, and it helps you get rid of them. But most of the time, that exile effect isn't going to do a ton. 5 mana is not an efficient way to blink a creature anyway. We have seen effects be a lot cheaper than that. And since all Planeswalkers are Mythic, again, the other line of text on this card is just going to be relevant 99.9% of the time. You'll only play this in very narrow situations where you have Into the Battlefield triggers, and lots of them, and even then, you may just bring it out of your sideboard against white and blue decks that want to use aura-based removal on your creatures. This is a pretty disappointing oath, Teferi, and I'm going to give it a D-. I think it could even end up being an F, sadly. Next, we have Primeval's Glorious Rebirth, which for 5 generic, a white, and a black is a legendary sorcery at rare. So this is the only gold legendary sorcery. We saw the 5 monocolored ones. And for a legendary sorcery, you have to control a legendary creature or planeswalker, or you just can't cast it. This one says, return all legendary permanent cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. I find it hard to imagine scenarios in Limited where this will really work out for you. As I've said throughout the week when doing this Limited review, yes, there's lots of legendaries in this set, but they are uncommon rarity or higher, so you're not going to get as many of them as you might think when you just look at this set. This asks not only that you play a decent number of legendary creatures, it asks that you also have a lot of ways of making them end up in the graveyard, and that you have to have one of them in play since this is a legendary sorcery, and those things combined is asking way too much, especially on a card that costs 7 freaking mana. Maybe you end up with a sweet black-white deck that really gets there with like 10 legendary creatures and has lots of ways of milling itself, and then maybe you run this. But that just won't happen very often, and I'm going to give it a D to reflect that. You know, if you pull it off, it will be really sweet and really fun, but doing it is just going to be so difficult. Next, we have Wrath Capuchin, Ship's Mage, which for 2 generic, a white, and a blue is a 3/3 legendary creature human wizard at uncommon. He has Flash, he has Flying, and when you cast historic spells, you can cast them as though they had Flash. This card is really good. It's another Signpost uncommon. They're all good, but this one has, maybe, it's one of the better ones because its base stats as a 4-mana 3/3 with Flying and Flash would be a good card on its own and probably good enough for a B- or something like that, at least if it were monocolored. But this also gives Flash to all your historic spells. While legendary creatures are going to be sort of hard to come by, as I said earlier, it is easier to end up with the broader historic cards, as that also includes artifacts and sagas. This can be especially gross with a saga because you can get one of your saga triggers on your opponent's turn with this, and some of them can be pretty potent if you're doing it on your opponent's turn. But in general, giving Flash to all historic spells is good, and overall I think this may be, again, one of the best Signpost uncommons. Just because he is so good on his own and the synergy he asks for isn't that hard to reach a critical mass of. I'm going to give him a B, and I think I would first pick him over a lot of non-premium removal and monocolored cards. He's worth the risk. Next, we have Rona, Disciple of Gix, who for 1 generic, a blue and a black, is a 2/2 legendary creature human artificer at uncommon. When she enters the battlefield, you may exile target historic card from your graveyard. You may cast cards, non-land cards, exiled with Rona, and you can pay 4 generic and tap her to exile the top card of your library. This is another Signpost uncommon who's interested in historic cards. Rona also does some really interesting things. I like the design on her a lot. She's pretty unique. She can exile cards from the top of your library and then allow you to cast them, which is a sort of a roundabout way of getting card advantage. She is slow, but if she's allowed to stay in play, she will certainly help you win with all the value she brings. She does have pretty awful stats as a 3-mana 2/2, and to be at her best, she asks for a historic card in your graveyard when you cast her, which isn't something you can guarantee on turn 3. As a result, I think she might be the weakest of the Signpost uncommons. She's cool and gives you nice card advantage, and I really want to just like grind out a game with her personally. It's like my kind of game, if you can just grind out a game with such a weird, clunky source of card advantage. But she's just so slow at the card advantage, and if you exile the top card of your library and it's not a land, you're just like, I mean, and it is a land, you're not going to feel great about that. It sucks that she can't also play lands. I don't know why they had to do that to her. I guess that would feel too green or something. Anyway, she's just a C, I think. She's the kind of blue-black, I mean, kind of Signpost uncommon that you'll only play if you end up in her color pair, and then she'll be solid, but she won't ever be incredible. Well, I shouldn't say that. In some late game scenarios, she will just get you there, but your opponent can also kill her with just about anything. Next, we have Shannas Legacy, which is a legendary creature human warrior at uncommon. She costs a green and a white, and she's a 0/0. Shannas Legacy can't be the target of abilities your opponents control. Note it's only abilities. She can still be the target of spells. And she gets +1/+1 for each creature you control. So on her own, she's a 1/1 for green and a white if you don't have any other creatures in play, and she grows. So she's basically a 2-drop that's relevant at all stages of the game, and that's something that can be pretty nice. The green-white deck has token producers at common, several of them. You can make night tokens, and even more, it can make sapling tokens really easily. So she will be quite large. That's sort of what she's the signpost in common for that color pair, so she gets big quickly in that deck if you really got there on it. She isn't great on her own, obviously, as a 1/1, but, you know, if your board state is reasonable when you play her, she'll be a lot bigger than that, even in the late game. And when you're only playing 2 mana for her and she's like a 5/5, that'll feel pretty good. Still, she's not so strong that she's the kind of signpost in common you want to first pick, and I'm going to give her a C+. So the black-green signpost in common is all about saplings, and I am super excited for that. It might be the color pair I'm most excited about. A 3-mana 2/3 who can make saplings for 4 generic mana is already a pretty good card. It's a nice mana sink for the late game, but the additional fact that it drains the opponent 1 life every time a sapling dies makes this even better. Even if you have no other ways of making saplings in your deck, Slimefoot is going to be a good guy to have around and a good way to spend your excess mana. He provides some serious flood insurance thanks to his ability to generate saplings. Black-green, of course, also has several other ways to make saplings, making him even better. I think he's another signpost in common that's worth considering first picking in some weaker pack 1, pick 1 scenarios, and I'm going to start him at B-. Next, we have Touchy OVA, Benthic Druid, who for 3 generic, a green, and a blue is a 3/3 legendary creature merfolk druid at uncommon. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and draw a card. I like this card a lot. If you know me, you know I love playing ploddingly slow limited decks that just slowly but surely destroy my opponent. And Touchy OVA is the kind of card that allows you to do that thanks to the fact that she draws you a card and gains you a life every time you play a land. It's not quite River Hoopoe, which is like the best blue-green signpost in common ever, but she's good. The ideal thing to do in most scenarios will be to play her on turn 5 and then play a land so you get value out of her no matter what. And if she's allowed to stay in play, she will win you the game thanks to all the cards she's going to draw you. While she's powerful, I don't feel like I should be first picking her, even though I want to. But like most signpost and commons, the deck in her color pair, blue-green, would be incredibly happy to have her. And I'm going to give her a C+. I do think she's held back a little bit by something that always happens to blue-green signpost and commons, and that is that they're not usually like really synergistic with what the color pair is interested in doing. They're usually just like value engines, which I love. But the fact that she doesn't have like super great synergy with anything, there's a few exceptions to that. You know, the green ramp spell will be great with this, for example. But there aren't a lot of ways of getting lands into play and really abusing her trigger at common and uncommon. You know, there are some rare ones. The Mending of Dominaria with Touchy OVA seems like one of the coolest things ever to do in this format, but that's a rare. So, yeah, I think she's held back a little bit. I don't think I want to first pick her, but I think she's pretty good. If you're in blue-green, you'll play like 2 or 3 of these, maybe even 4 of these, and be pretty happy. So, C+ it is. Next, we have Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. 3 generic, a white, and a blue for a legendary planeswalker, Teferi, at Mythic Rare. He starts with 4 loyalty, and he has a +1, draw a card. At the beginning of the next instep, untap 2 lands. He has a -3, put target non-land permanent into its owner's library, 3rd from the top, and his emblem, his -8 is, you get an emblem with, whenever you draw a card, exile target permanent and opponent controls. Teferi is back, and luckily he's way better than his oath. Like Karn does, as we'll see, he can both draw cards and protect himself, though he protects himself by fate sealing a creature instead of making a creature token. The fact that his +1 untaps 2 lands is a nice way of making sure you have mana up for various costs, and the fact that -3 can hit any non-land permanent is nice. Obviously his ultimate is powerful and probably worth using as soon as you get him to 8 loyalty, as it will win you the game pretty quickly, though if you can help keeping him in play, you can use his +1 and start using that to exile things in addition to the card you draw every turn. Still, he is gold, and while he is very powerful, he isn't going to be that good when you're behind, and I think that keeps him from being a straight-up bomb, but he comes close. About as close as you can get. I'm going to give him a B+. You're going to first pick him in most scenarios. Next, we have Tiana, Ship's Caretaker, who for 3 generic, a red, and a white is a legendary creature, Angel Artificer, with flying and first strike. Whenever an aura or equipment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may return that card to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next instep. Again, basically all these signposts and commons feel like rares in other sets. And Tiana is the signpost uncommon, obviously, for red-white, which is a deck that cares about auras and equipment. I would already feel pretty good about playing a 5-mana 3/3 with flying in first strike. The fact that she doesn't let your auras or equipment go to the graveyard, basically, just makes her better. Red-white is going to be a great home for equipment and auras, thanks in part to her. What's great, too, is that she's a good place to put equipment and auras because of her keyword ability, so she synergizes fairly well with auras and equipment in 2 ways. Still, she is more of a build-around than some of the other signpost uncommons. If you don't have auras and equipments, you're getting a reasonably efficient creature, but nothing exciting. I think she's probably a C if you don't have enough auras and or equipment, and probably like a B- when you get there. Part of the problem is your equipment is almost never going to go to the graveyard, so if you're a more equipment-heavy version of the deck, like, even though she's going to be good to equip equipment to, the fact that, you know, your equipment isn't going to the graveyard a lot, unless your opponent's just straight up blowing it up, you know, which they might in game 2 and 3, but in game 1, it's probably not going to happen much. So that part doesn't matter. The aura part does matter, and I think that's what's the strongest part about her is it makes it so your auras, your creatures who are enchanted getting blown up, does not make you get 2 for 1. And that's a nice little additional upside. That said, people are probably just going to set their sights on Tiana and kill her if she's the one with the auras on it too. So, you know, she has a reasonable ceiling, but not an incredible one. And her floor is, you know, average, mediocre maybe. So I don't think you should first pick her at all. But if you're in red-white, you will definitely play her and feel fine about it. Next, we have our single, just colorless card, colorless non-artifact card, and that is Karn, Scion of Urza, who is 4 generic mana for a legendary planeswalker, Karn, at Mythic Rare. He starts with 5 loyalty. His +1 is reveal the top 2 cards of your library. An opponent chooses one of them. Put that card into your hand and exile the other with a silver counter on it. The -1 is put a card you own with a silver counter on it from exile into your hand. And his -2 is create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. No surprise here, Karn is really, really good. Again, part of what makes Karn so good, unlike a lot of planeswalkers, is you can play him in any deck you make. So if you first pick him, he's making it into your deck. He does 2 things that good planeswalkers usually need to do, too. He can protect himself, and he can draw you cards. It would be nice if he could kill a creature, too, but obviously, you know, he can't do everything. He starts with relatively high loyalty for a 4-mana planeswalker, too, and his +1 is going to net you a card one way or another. Even if you get a land out of it, it isn't the worst thing to do. Plus, you can always use his -1 to get back something your opponent didn't want you to have. His -2 is what he uses to protect himself. And to be fair, that part of Karn is a little bit build-around-ish. Sure, even if you have 0 other artifacts in play, he's going to make a 1/1 token, but that's not going to do a great job of protecting him since he's losing 2 loyalty to do it in the first place. You definitely want a creature who can more effectively protect him. That artifact token can't do the job alone at all. In a deck with a lot of artifacts, Karn is going to be good, though, if you're at parity or ahead, but not as good if you're behind. Though, even if you're behind, he's probably going to draw you a couple cards and prevent some damage done to you, since your opponent will be attacking him. I'm really being nitpicky here, but I do want to discuss every element of this card and my assessment of it. Obviously, he's good in any deck, and I think I'm going to give him an A-. You will first pick him, and the fact that he's colorless, again, that's fantastic. In a deck that is artifact-heavy, though, he probably goes all the way up to an A+, since he can churn out much larger construct tokens in those decks, and they'll do a better job of protecting him while he draws you cards if you have more artifacts in play. Speaking of artifacts, let's move to those. First artifact we're looking at is Aether Glider, which costs 3 generic mana. It's an artifact creature bird construct at common. It's a 2/1, it's got flying, and it can't block. A 3 mana 2/1 that can't block isn't special, but it's fine and would see play in any format. The fact this is an artifact-heavy format and that artifacts are also historic makes it good. That's something to keep in mind with all of these artifacts, by the way. I'll try not to repeat myself too much, but a nice thing about all of these artifacts basically is they fit very well into a lot of different strategies in this format, because there are some decks that care more about specifically artifacts, and there are some color pairs that care more about historic, and they're good in all of them. And that is going to improve the grade of basically all of these artifacts by a little bit, you know, maybe by a half a letter grade or something. This format also has a preponderance of equipment and auras, and this can do some damage with those since it has flying. None of that makes this a card you want to take early. But if your deck is interested in any of those things, and it probably is, I think you feel fine about playing this, and I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Amaranthine Wall, which for 4 generic is an artifact creature wall at uncommon. It's a 0/6, it's a defender, has defender, and for 2 generic, you can give it indestructible until end of turn. 4 mana 0/6s normally aren't something you really want to play. This one can make itself indestructible and block indefinitely, provided you have 2 mana lying around. And it gets the same small boost all these artifacts do, since artifacts are especially good in this format, and it'll be fine in a deck that's interested in the long game or a deck attacking in the sky. Still, I don't think you play this in most cases. It's just having to leave up 2 mana to make it indestructible all the time is like the ideal thing to do, but if you're doing that, in most cases, you're really probably hindering the way you're building up your board. Sure, in the later part of the game, like when the you're trying to just survive, it'll be better because you have like 8 mana in play. But right after you play it, you're not going to be wanting to make it indestructible. Granted, it does have 6 toughness, so what can attack through it at that point? But still, 2 is pretty steep to give it indestructible, and as a result, I'm going to give it a D+. Next up, we have Black Blade Reforge, which for 2 generic mana is a legendary artifact equipment at rare. It says equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each land you control, equip legendary creature for 3 generic mana, or equip something else for 7 generic mana. This card, it's supposed to represent something really cool in Magic's past and its present, because Gideon is now the person wielding Black Blade. But if you don't have a legendary creature in play, this is horrible. It's basically impossible to equip. If you do have a legendary creature, it isn't impossible, but still not exactly cheap. The stats boost will be impressive enough, but you have to be putting it on a creature who already has evasion for it to really make much of a difference in most cases. If your deck has several legendary creatures in it, this is playable, but it isn't great. I think it's probably worth playing in the red-white deck, since there are several equipment synergies in that color pair. So you basically need to be there and have lots of legendary creatures for this to be good. But it's going to hurt when you have no legendaries in play, and that's going to happen. As I keep stressing, legendary creatures aren't, you're not going to have 10 of them in your deck in most cases. I think this is only going to be playable in narrow situations. I think in your average limited deck in this format, it's like a D. And I think in a deck that got there on a decent number of legendary creatures, got there on liking equipment, it's probably a C. So it's not exactly... It's definitely not the kind of rare equipment that you are really excited about, even if you're in the heavy equipment deck. Though that is where it is certainly a solid playable. It's unplayable or close to it in most decks, and you definitely shouldn't first pick it. Next, we have Blood Tallow Candle, which for 1 generic is a common artifact, and it has an activated ability. You can pay 6 generic to tap it and sacrifice it, and give target creature -5/-5 until end of turn. I think this is actually going to overperform. Yes, it's clunky, but the fact that this format has payoffs again for both historic and artifact cards makes this better than it looks. I'm not trying to tell you it's great. It isn't. But hey, it is removal that synergizes with a lot of what this format wants to do, and that's good enough for a C for me. I mean, this format also has several ways of getting artifacts back from the graveyard, and it'll feel pretty great when you do that because, yeah, it's inefficient, but you're going to kill 2 creatures with it. Also doesn't hurt that it is removal in any deck. Some color pairs. In this format, interestingly, like white has really no premium removal at common, and green has no premium removal, period, and blue has no premium removal, period. So those colors will be really interested in playing this. Red and black have so much removal in this format that they might be less interested in this, but those other 3 colors really don't have that much removal. Granted, this isn't premium either, but if there's so little removal in those color pairs, you'll be playing Blood Tallow Candle and you'll feel fine about it. Next, we have Dampening Sphere, which for 2 generic is an uncommon artifact. If a land is tapped for 2 or more mana, it produces colorless mana instead of any other type and amount. Each spell a player casts costs 1 more to cast for each other spell that player has cast this turn. It's a lot of casts. This isn't really made for this limited format. It seems to be more about shutting down Tron in Modern and Eldrazi in Eternal formats and in Modern. Neither line of text is going to do enough in most situations to warrant playing this. There is 1 land in the format that can produce a bunch of mana. One we'll get to later, and I guess maybe you cite it in if your opponent's playing that. But even then, it will only be affecting 1 card in your opponent's deck. I'm just going to give it an F. I mean, the fact that it makes your opponent's spells cost more if, they cast 1 spell, the next one costs 1 more, will occasionally come up, but a lot of the time it won't. I mean, limited formats pretty regularly are just like a 1 spell a turn format, and that's fine a lot of the time. It'll occasionally come up, but most of the time it just won't do enough, and I think that makes it an F. Next, we have Forebears Blade, which for 3 generic is an artifact equipment at rare. Equipped creature gets +3/+0 and has vigilance and trample. When equipped creature dies, attach Forebears Blade to target creature you control. This is another not super exciting equipment at rare, but at least it's way better than Black Blade. The first time you equip this, it is kind of a pain, but once it starts equipping for free, you have a real weapon on your hands. It can make basically any creature a threat for free, and if your opponent decides they have to block and kill said threat, well, someone else is there to pick up this sword. I like that element of the card a lot. I think it's about a B-. I think in some weak packs you will first pick this. The idea that it can turn anything into a threat. Like a 4-1 with Vigilance and Trample is already a problem, you know? And that's like worst case scenario in most situations. So a lot of the times you'll put it on something where this makes a huge difference. And so for that reason, I think it's probably the best equipment in the entire set, which is saying something. There's a lot of equipment in the set. We'll see more. I think it's the best one in the set. I like it a fair amount, and I'll be happy to first pick it. You don't really need to even be in the equipment interested deck for this to be at its best, though obviously it is a little better there. Next, we have Gilded Lotus. For 5 generic mana, it's a rare artifact, and you can tap it to add 3 mana of any one color. This is a reprint, and it's an interesting one. It offers some amazing ramp and fixing, but it doesn't come until turn 5. Of course, it can produce mana right away, so usually when you play it, you can actually also play something else. This is a card that is going to be able to turn a deck into a crazy ramp deck capable of playing 7 and 8 drops without too much effort, and I think that's a good thing. Problem is, you're not always going to be in a situation where that kind of deck is draftable. Still, the fact that this enables splashes and like triple colored splashes potentially makes this a pretty good card. And maybe I'm overrating it here, but I don't hate the idea of first picking this. It keeps you incredibly open while enabling you to go down a pretty powerful path. Pick up a few other sources of ramp and fixing, and you end up with something really sweet. I'm going to give this a B. Next we have Guardians of Coilos, which for 5 generic mana is an artifact creature construct at common. It's a 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, you may return another target historic permanent you control to its owner's hands. I emphasize you control because the first time I read this, I thought you could return any of them. And I was like really excited about this because it could either be like a mana war or you could use it on your own guys. You can only use it on your own guys. So this card asks you to have both historic permanents and historic permanents who can take advantage of getting played again. It'll be nice against aura-based removal that blue and white have, and historic permanents with enter the battlefield triggers. However, a lot of the time bouncing something isn't going to be worth it. In those situations, you're looking at a 5 mana 4/4, and that's about it. There will definitely be some decks that can take advantage of this, but I don't think they will be very common, and I'm going to give this a D+ to reflect that. Next up, we have Helm of the Host, which for 4 generic mana is a legendary artifact equipment at rare. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a token that's a copy of equipped creature, except the token isn't legendary if equipped creature is legendary. That token gains haste. It has a equip cost of 5 generic mana. This is a really cool card. I love the design, but I think it's a little too slow for limited. Making token copies of creatures every turn, including legendary ones, is pretty cool and can enable some interesting combos, but the problem with that is the creature you put this on basically needs to be good already. Sure, if you're copying a 2/2 every turn, that will add up, but I don't think that's enough. Especially when you have to pay a total of 9 mana to get this onto a creature the first time. That's going to be 2 turns worth of mana in most cases, and even after that first time, you have to spend a whopping 5. Now, this can be especially gross on creatures with enter the battlefield ability, since you get the trigger every single turn, but I just don't see this working out for people in most cases. I think it's basically a trap in limited, and I'm going to give it an F to help you steer clear of it. Sure, sometimes you'll really go off with this, and I'm sure I'll lose to this when I'm recording at some point, but I think much more frequently you'll find yourself without the time to play it and equip it, and it will rot in your hand. Next up, we have Howling Golem, which for 3 generic mana is an artifact creature golem at uncommon. It's a 2/3, and when it attacks or blocks, each player draws a card. This is a callback to Howling Mine, and I think the card is fine. Generally, you don't want to be helping your opponent draw cards, but at least if you're the one attacking, you get the first crack at using the new card you draw, unlike with Howling Mine, where your opponent gets the first crack. If you block, your opponent will get the first crack at the new card. It has decent stats for the mana cost, and the opponent will have to think twice about killing it, so it can cause some interesting mind games. I don't think it is a good card by any stretch, but I think it's a reasonable card you'll play sometimes, and I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have Icy Manipulator, which for 4 generic mana is an uncommon artifact, and you can pay 1 generic and tap it to tap an artifact, creature, or land. Icy Manipulator's back, and every time it's been printed, it's been excellent and limited, and that's what it will be here. It's one of the best uncommons in this set, and first picking it feels great because you know that, no matter what, you'll be playing it. The fact that this format has bonuses for artifact and historic permanents also doesn't hurt. The ability to shut down your opponent's best attacker or blocker every turn, depending on the board state, for only a single mana is excellent. It even has the flexibility to tap down lands or artifacts if the situation calls for it, though like 98% of the time it'll be better to tap down creatures. Sure, 4 mana to play it up front can be a bit scary sometimes, but after that it will more than pay you back. Sometimes the best thing to do is wait to play it on turn 5 when you can actually use the ability right away, and then you don't feel so bad about it. I'm happy to first pick this, and I'm going to give it a B. Next, we have Gyro's Familiar, which for 4 generic mana is an artifact creature bird. It's uncommon, it's a 2/2, it has flying, and historic spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This is something of a build around. Sure, a 4 mana 2/2 with flying isn't horrendous, but it isn't great on its own. However, I mean, your average limited deck, I think, like I keep saying, will have like 5 to 7 historic spells since it's such a broad category. And I think even in a deck that only has like the bare minimum of historic spells, it's probably a C-. Making a couple of the cards in your deck cost less and being a decent attacker in the air isn't too bad. However, if you have a lot of historic permanents, this gets to be really, really good. I generally like the cards that are historic payoffs more than the ones that are legendary or artifact payoffs because historic is the broadest category of them all. So reaching that critical mass of historic cards is way easier to do than it is with legendaries or artifacts. Getting to 10 historic permanents is going to be easily attainable, and Gyro's Bird here will be very good in a deck that can do that. I think it's at least a B- in a deck that gets there, and it might even go higher. It is a fragile creature, so it's hard to give it much more than a B-, I think, but man, will it make you have some amazing turns if you're allowed to untap after you play it and your deck is stacked with historic permanents. Next, we have Jousting Lance, which for 2 generic is an equipment at common. Equipped creature gets +2/+0, and as long as it's your turn, the equipped creature has first strike. This is an okay piece of equipment, especially for a common. I mean, the +2/+0 part isn't great, but on your turn, your creature having first strike means it is going to be a real pain to block. Still, an equip cost of 3, that's pretty steep. You'll play this in decks that are interested in equipment, or that are really aggressive, but not really anywhere else. I'm going to give it a C-. Next up, we have Juggernaut, which for 4 generic is an artifact creature Juggernaut at uncommon. It's a 5/3. It attacks each combat if able, and Juggernaut can't be blocked by walls. This is another really famous old card from Magic's history. It was once thought to be incredibly powerful. I mean, the game was different. It was incredibly powerful. Icy Manipulator is an old card too, and it's remained powerful. Juggernaut's not an incredible card anymore. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad either. He has, obviously he's historic, and he's an artifact, so that helps. And a 4 mana 5/3 that has to attack isn't terrible, but it's not going to last long for this world. Of course, if you can put auras on it or equip it, it does become a serious threat. It also combos really, really well with the blue removal spell that turns a creature into a wall. That's a funny little 2-card combo that you can do. Basically turns it into pacifism, and Juggernaut can just bash faces in. But a 5/3 that has to attack every turn isn't going to be long for this world. It's definitely a threat. It's definitely a nuisance for your opponent to deal with, but it's not that hard to deal with, and I think it's just a solid C. Next up, we have Mishra's Self-Replicator, which for 5 generic mana is a 2/2 artifact creature assembly worker. That's a rare. Whenever you cast a historic spell, you may pay 1 generic. If you do, create a token that's a copy of Mishra's Self-Replicator. This is obviously built around for historic decks, and unlike some of them, which, if you have 3, 5, 6 historic cards in your deck that are still okay if you only have that many, this one really, really needs you to have a lot of historic spells or it's not going to be worth it. And so I think it's an F in a deck that ends up with, a lowish, medium number of historic spells, because you're playing a 5 mana 2/2, and if you can't copy it easily or frequently, it's not going to be that good. If you get like 10 or more historic spells, which I don't think is a really tall order, especially if you're building around various cards that care about that, it gets to be a lot better. I think it's a solid B. And the ridiculous thing that happens is you make copies of Mishra's Self-Replicator, then you cast another historic spell, and you get to make 2 copies, and then it just gets crazier and crazier. Granted, you do have to pay mana, so at some point, but if you can make 2 copies like a few times, you're just going to win with all these 2/2s. But it has a horrible floor, like it's horrendous in your average limited deck in the format. Has a great ceiling, but I still think that means you don't first pick it. You pick it up once it looks like this is going to work out for you, and you can do some crazy things with it. Next, we have Mox Amber, which for 0 mana is a mythic rare legendary artifact, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color among legendary creatures and planeswalkers you control. This is a card that has real implications for Constructed. I'm afraid it isn't going to be worth playing, basically, in Limited, though. You aren't going to have a legendary creature or planeswalker in play early enough for the Amber to actually produce mana in the early going. Sure, dropping it on turn 3 is a nice way of ramping yourself, but as soon as you lose your legendary creature, which again, you're not just always going to have one, it turns into a hunk of useless metal. This is going to be good in Constructed because you can jam as many legendary creatures into your deck as you want, including some of the 1-drops out there. That's just not going to be the case here. Even with the payoffs it can bring between being legendary and an artifact, I think this is unplayable in limited and in F. That said, it has a very good chance of being worth a ton of money if it, the speculation about the card is correct and it sees playing constructed. It's mythic rare, so first picking it for that reason isn't a bad idea. Some people hate the idea of money drafting, but money drafting actually helps you get better at limited because it lets you play limited more, assuming you have a tight budget anyway. So that's one way to look at it. Anyway, in F. Next, we have Navigators Compass, which for 1 generic is an artifact at common. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life, and you can tap it, and until end of turn, target land you control becomes the basic land type of your choice in addition to its other types. This is interesting. It provides fixing in a unique way that we haven't really seen a lot of, on top of having, the synergy all artifacts have. And it doesn't hurt that it gains you life on top of that. Sure, it isn't a mana rock in the real sense of the word, since it isn't going to ramp you at all. But being able to make one of your lands into whatever land type it needs for you to play cards you're splashing is great. That seems pretty reasonable, and I'm going to give it a C. Next up, we have Partic Wanderer, which for 6 generic is an artifact creature golem at common. It's a 5/5, and it's got trample. Not super interested in playing a 6-mana 5/5 with trample. But, again, because this set has several archetypes and build-around cards that care about artifacts and historics, I think this is a card you'll end up playing a decent amount of the time at the top of your curve. You won't really be happy about it, but I don't think you feel bad about it like you would in most formats either, and I'm going to give them a C-. Next, we have Power Stone Shard, which for 3 generic is an artifact at common, and you can tap it to add colorless for each artifact you control named Power Stone Shard. This is an actual mana rock. It isn't going to be great if you only have one, but it does help you ramp, and it has a useful card type, again, for this format. I'm going to give it a D if you only have one of them. However, if you can get more of these, like 2 or 3 or 4, things get a little more interesting. Still, because you can never be sure you'll get more than one, I don't think, even in the cases where you have 3 or 4, it gets higher than a C. It'll definitely feel better than that. Like if you have a crazy hand where you're like turn 3 Power Stone Shard, turn 4 Power Stone Shard, it'll feel like a B plus. But you just can't count on that happening enough. I mean, this will be good if your deck's interested in ramping and you'll even play the one copy of it in that deck, and you'll definitely play multiples in other situations. But it's a very inconsistent card just because it needs a lot of help to really turn into something powerful. Next, we have Shield of the Realm, which for 2 generic mana is an artifact equipment at uncommon. And it says, if a source would deal damage to equipped creature, prevent 2 of that damage. Equip 1. This is an interesting equipment. I don't normally like equipment that gives no stats boost at all. But preventing damage as a sort of static effect is strong, and you can sort of think of it as giving your creature +0/+2 almost, except it's a little better than that in a lot of ways. It makes it harder for damage dealing removal to kill it, and it makes the creature a lot harder to kill in combat. I feel like the cost of the spell and the equip cost are low enough that this is actually playable, especially in a format with equipment and artifact synergies. I think it's perfectly solid, and I'll give it a C. Next, we have Short Sword, which for 1 generic mana is an artifact equipment at common. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, and it has equip 1. Of the common or uncommon equipment, I think I like this one the most. It doesn't do anything flashy, but it gives the stats boost it gives very efficiently. We've seen this card before, a couple times actually. One of them was Leonin's Scimitar, and that was perfectly solid in its format. Still, it isn't great, and you shouldn't take it too early. I think it's a C, maybe a C+ in a deck that loves equipment. Next, we have Skittering Surveyor, which for 3 generic is a 1/2 artifact creature construct at common. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. This is a great source of fixing attached to a useful card type, much like Navigator's Compass, but this is definitely better. Why? Well, because it draws you a card. Sure, it's always a land, but that means it makes sure you hit your land drop. It also has a body that can actually block Saproling tokens and trade with X1s, which isn't irrelevant. I think this will be the premier source of fixing in the set for decks that aren't green anyway, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Sorcerer's Wand, which for 1 generic mana is an equipment at uncommon. It says equipped creature has tap. This creature deals 1 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If this creature is a wizard, it deals 2 damage to that player or planeswalker instead. Equip cost of 3. When I first saw this, I think it could do damage to creatures. It can't, and I think that really limits it. I don't think playing this in a deck without a significant number of creatures is going to be worth it because it's too expensive to equip for the payoff. 2 damage, though, is definitely worth it, so this is basically a build around. In a wizard deck, I think it's playable, but I think it's an F in other decks and like a C in a wizard deck. Next we have Sparring Construct, which for 1 generic mana is a 1/1 artifact creature construct at common. When it dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, so basically Arcbound Worker. This card seems kind of random in a set with no +1/+1 counter synergies, but hey, it's historic, it's an artifact, and costing only 1 mana means that it does a good job of triggering cards that care about that, especially the cards that can sacrifice artifacts, like Orcish Vandal and Sage of Lot Nam. Still, it isn't great or anything. I think you only play it when you really need more artifact historic cards, as otherwise it's fairly underwhelming. For me, that makes it a C-. Next up, we have ThranTemporal Gateway, which for 4 generic is a legendary artifact at rare. You can pay 4 generic and tap it to put a historic permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. This seems like it has some potential, but in looking through the historic permanents in this set, there aren't really that many things you can cheat into play with this that makes it very exciting, as the majority of them cost around 4 mana. If you put a 5 mana permanent into play with this, it doesn't feel like you're really getting there. Sure, it does let you flash things into play, and that's fine, but think about the total of an 8 mana investment up front to play a creature with flash. That's really bad. There are some exceptions, though. If your deck has like 2 or more of the following: Daragaz, Madrasah, Multani, Grun, Torgar, Ugaros, Khazarov, Belzenlock, Zahid, Slinvada, In Bolas's Clutches, and Evra, then you probably have enough to want to play this. But note that most of those are rare or mythic, so that won't come up very often. I'm going to recommend not playing this in most cases and give it an F, but give it a C+ in a deck that actually has 2 of those cards I just mentioned. Next up, we have Traxos, Scourge of Krug, who for 4 generic mana is a legendary artifact creature. He's a construct at rare. He's a 7/7. He's got trample, and Traxos, Scourge of Krug enters the battlefield tapped and doesn't untap during your untap step. Whenever you cast a historic spell, untap Traxos. This is a strong payoff for having lots of historic permanents. Unfortunately, he's terrible, even if you have a handful of historic permanents like you usually will. But if your deck has 10 or more, he's going to be really good. As a 7/7 Trampler that early, it's just not something that's easy to deal with. He is an F in your typical limited deck, but like a B in a deck that has 10 or more historic spells. Next, we have Urza's Tome, which for 2 generic mana is an artifact at uncommon. Why this isn't legendary, I don't know. They thought they had enough legendaries, I guess. But anyway, 3 generic, tap it, draw a card, then discard a card unless you exile a historic card from your graveyard. Obviously, this is a build-around because paying 3 every single turn to loot is not very efficient. Decks will still be interested in it sometimes, but you definitely need historic cards in your graveyard for this to be really giving you the value you want. It is nice that it helps get historic cards into your graveyard itself, but I think it's like a D- in a deck that has like a few historic cards, and like a C+ in a deck that has enough and is interested in this sort of slow, grindy game of drawing cards like this. Next, we have Voltaic Servant, who for 2 generic mana is a 1/3 artifact creature construct at common, and at the beginning of your instep, untap target artifact. A 2 mana 1/3 presents underwhelming, but fine stats, especially when it comes with a useful ability that allows you to untap artifacts. On its own, that means Voltaic Servant sort of has vigilance, but the real value will come when you have artifacts in play that have abilities that require them to tap, like Urza's Tome, for example, and this lets you use those twice a turn. Obviously, if you have some artifact creatures who have more impressive stats than the Servant, you can always use it to give them pseudo-vigilance, which is way stronger than it is to give this construct pseudo-vigilance. In general, this card brings you decent value on decent stats, so it gets a decent grade, a C. Next, we have Weatherlight, which for 4 generic mana is a 4/5 legendary artifact vehicle at Mythic Rare. It has flying, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, you reveal a historic card from among them and put it into your hand, and you put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And it has Crew for 3 generic mana. Seeing the Weatherlight again, this time as a vehicle, is really cool, and hey, it happens to be very powerful. Crew 3 is sort of a lot, but it isn't insane, especially for a 4/5 that is going to draw you card most of the time when it hits your opponent. Because it looks at what is essentially 1/8 of your library every time it does combat damage to a player, you don't even need an insane number of historic permanents to draw a card with it consistently. Something like 5 or 6 will make it so you hit frequently. Sure, it is going to be better if you have a ton of them, but it still provides a fast clock in the air and card advantage, even in a deck that doesn't have a critical mass of historic permanents. And that's the kind of card I want to start my draft with, especially when it's colorless, and I'm giving this an A-. Alright, that's it for artifacts. Now let's move to lands. First up, we have Cabal Stronghold, which is a land at rare. You tap it to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, and you can pay 3 and tap it to add black for each basic swamp you control. So it's sort of a callback to Cabal Coffers. And this was the land I mentioned earlier that Dampening Sphere might be useful against, but generally this isn't going to be very good in limited. While this format has a few incentives for going mono black, it is still going to be very hard to do in most cases, and if you can't do that, this land is useless. Sure, it at least taps for colorless mana, but in most cases that means it's a downgrade of your other basic lands, like your regular old swamp. If you go mono black, this will be worth playing, but I don't see that as an easy thing to accomplish, and I'm going to give this an F as a reflection of that. Next up, we have the check lands in this set: Woodland Cemetery, Sulphur Falls, Clifftop Retreat, Hinterland Harbor, and Isolated Chapel. They all enter the battlefield tapped unless you control a land of a basic land type of one of the colors it can produce. For example, Woodland Cemetery taps for black or green, but it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a swamp or a forest. The check lands provide excellent mana fixing, and as such, they are the kind of card that you should value reasonably when you are in any of these color pairs, or if you're trying to splash something. However, taking these early isn't what you want to do. Take them if you see them mid-pack and they fit with what you're already trying to do. I'm going to give them a C+. Next, we have Memorial to Folly, which is an uncommon land. It enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it to add black to your mana pool, and you can pay 2 generic and a black to tap it and sacrifice it to return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is the first of a cycle of nice utility lands. Memorials that all come into play tapped, produce colored mana, and have an activated ability that uses the same color of mana. Utility lands like these are actually pretty good. In a lot of ways, they are upgrades over the basic lands in your deck. Yes, they do come into play tapped, but the value of a card that can produce mana while you need it and then turn into a spell in the late game cannot be understated. The deserts from Amonkhet block are sort of comparable here, though those were even better because there were cards that gave you extra value for controlling them. Still, I like these, and I feel like people are going to underestimate them early in the format. This one in particular is quite nice. Being able to get back a creature from your graveyard after this spends several turns providing much needed black mana is going to feel great. Getting back bombs, creatures with enter the battlefield abilities, or creatures with death touch is going to feel particularly good, and I'm going to give this a C+. Next, we have Memorial to Genius, which is a land at uncommon. It enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it to add blue to your mana pool, and you can pay 4 generic and a blue to sacrifice it and draw 2 cards. This one's also good. Turning into 2 cards in the late game is some nice value to get out of your land. The activated ability is expensive here, so it's going to be something of a flood insurance type ability that you use in the late game when you're running out of gas and have tons of mana lying around. That kind of ability isn't a bad thing, though. It just means it's better than an island, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Memorial to Glory. It enters the battlefield tapped. It's an uncommon. You can tap it to add white, and for 3 generic and a white, you can sacrifice it to create 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. Being able to turn a land into 2 soldier tokens in the latter part of the game is a nice bonus, and like the other two, I think this one deserves a C+. Worth noting that this one sort of synergizes with especially the green-white deck that wants to go wide, and the other ones don't have a whole lot of synergy with a particular deck, and this one does, so that may make it a little better in some scenarios. Next, we have Memorial to Unity, which enters the battlefield tapped. It's an uncommon. You can tap it to add green, and for 2 generic and a green, you can sacrifice it and look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This one has a cheap activated ability that basically allows you to draw a card. Sometimes this will miss, but I mean, if you have 15 creatures in your deck, it probably won't. The card selection it gives you is pretty nice, even if it does only let you choose between creatures. Like the first 3 in the cycle, I think it's another C+. Next, we have Memorial to War, a land at uncommon. It enters the battlefield tapped. It can tap to add red, and for 4 generic and a red, you can sacrifice it, and what does this one do? Well, it destroys the land. Save the worst for last here. While the other 4 memorials are pretty equally good, this one is not. Destroying lands is never a great route to take in Limited, especially when you need 6 lands in play. 5 mana plus this memorial to do it. This is good against opponents running powerful non-basics maybe, but have we seen any of those? Not really. The memorial lands aren't really strong enough to warrant playing this. Sure, it is still basically a more flexible mountain, so I'm not saying you shouldn't play it. It's just that its activated ability will come up incredibly rarely, and the other 4 memorials abilities are a lot better. I'm going to give this a C. Next, we have Zhalfirin Void, which is an uncommon land. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 1, and you can tap it to add colorless. A land that scries for you is nice. A land that produces colorless mana is not. I don't think the payoff is enough here to play this and make your mana base worse. If you end up in a deck that is monocolor or close to monocolor, it does get better since your mana will be pretty good in those situations. It won't really hurt your mana base, and it will basically be all upside. But that's not going to happen very much, and as a result, I'm going to give it a D-. Well, that is the final card in Dominaria. I've covered every single card in the set, told you my thoughts about them, and that's the end of the color by color review of every single card in the set. As I mentioned earlier, limited review week isn't over yet. I still have a few other videos coming out talking about archetypes, the best commons and uncommons, and things like that. So make sure you tune in for those as well. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to share it and like it. And if you want to make sure you catch the rest of my limited review and the Dominaria draft video, the first one of which will be coming out on Friday, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.